Max, if you could talk about how you chose the title of your book, Goliath.
I originally wanted to call it Master Race Democracy, but I thought it would have to be sold in a brown paper bag, like the album with John and Yoko nude on the cover. So I was convinced against that. Then I wanted to call it Masada, which is the second century AD Roman era fortress where Jewish fanatics holed up after slaughtering Jewish moderates at Ein Gedi who wanted to negotiate with the Roman Empire after they rebelled against the Roman Empire and then committed mass suicide rather than surrender. And Masada has kind of become a source of inspiration for people on the right wing in Israel, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who sees the leadership at Masada as kind of as role models, and he's spoken of them as role models. The Israeli political psychologist Daniel Bartal, who has helped pioneer the field of trauma studies and done enormous work on understanding the attitudes of Jewish Israeli society, conceived the term Masada syndrome to explain the syndrome that many in Israeli society had fallen under. So I thought it was an appropriate title, but my editors in Nation Books thought Goliath would be better. It plays to a more familiar biblical tale of David and Goliath, and traditionally Israel, the state of Israel, sought to portray itself as a David surrounded by the Arab Goliath, and the title flips the script. Israel's the Goliath with the most powerful military in the Middle East with a special relationship with the US, and so we went with it, and it worked. The only unfortunate thing was Malcolm Gladwell had this book come out at the same time, David and Goliath. And there's one line in the book where he says, he writes, Israel is a David. And he doesn't explain why and just moves on. So my book's the counterpoint.
We had J.J. Goldberg on Democracy Now! Debating Ali Abunim of Electronic Intifada. J.J. Goldberg is with The Forward in July. This was a few weeks into the Israeli assault. Ali asked him if he'd been to Gaza, and J.J. responded, "No, I would be shot if I went to Gaza."
Right.
You're an American Jew, an American Jewish reporter in Gaza. Talk about your experience there. You actually tweeted about what J.J. Goldberg said.
I did, but I actually don't know if J.J. Goldberg is an Israeli citizen, in which case he would not be allowed to enter Gaza. He is a former sniper for the Israeli border police. So another foreign fighter for JSIL, who's now part of the American mainstream media. And I found you have to watch this debate. This is one of the most incredible moments of political theater that I've seen in a long time. It's a total smackdown. And J.J. Goldberg, I found it really satisfying because J.J. had attacked my book. I thought he smeared me. And he sort of fabricated quotes by me, or doctored quotes that I delivered at a talk at the University of Pennsylvania to suggest that I was calling for the expulsion of all Israeli Jews. I was satisfied to see the smackdown. But as far as his suggestion that if Jews go to Gaza, they will be shot on sight, I can tell you that towards the end of my trip there, after the ceasefire, my roommates were Jesse Rosenfeld and Dan Cohen in Gaza City. So we were thinking of putting up a sign like the law offices of Blumenthal, Cohen, and Rosenfeld. And they accompanied me to Hamas press conferences. We went to the Al-Qassam Brigade's victory celebration in the rubble of Shuja'iyah, and nobody really cares that we're Jewish. However, so there really is no threat. The worst thing that happened to me, as I said, was the attempt at forcing me to have an overdose of sugar, because everywhere I went, in the rubble, in Gaza City and elsewhere, people continually handed me candy and grapes and popsicles and cold water, often as they were describing the massacre of their families. I've never seen so much character in my life. It put everything in perspective for me. And I think it made me a better person to see people behave that way after going through this interminable cavalry. Finally, it has to be acknowledged that the Arab world is the chief vehicle for anti-Semitism, and it is a reaction against Zionism. It can't be defended, but it has to be understood in context. The state of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu and its leadership claim to speak on behalf of all the world's Jews while they are conducting these periodic slaughters in the Gaza Strip, while they are abusing people and occupying people. And people in the Gaza Strip don't know any other Jews but them. That's a problem. It has to be ameliorated. I've said again and again that the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, which claims to represent the true Islam, is inspiring Islamophobia, just as the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, or JSIL, which claims to speak on behalf of world Jewry, is inspiring anti-Semitism. Both have to be taken on if we're to seriously take on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, which are two sides of the same coin.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has recently called for taking Israel to the International Criminal Court and for the UN Security Council to impose a 3-year deadline in Israel to end the occupation. Hanan Ashrawi, the Palestinian lawmaker, recently said, if the U.S. wants to isolate itself, if Palestinians lose U.S. government support, if the U.S. wants to isolate itself as a reaction to Palestinians joining the international community, then they're welcome to do that. The American funding is not that essential to Palestinian survival. Quite often, joining the international community, having the protection of the law, and so on, is much more important than getting some funding from Congress. That's conditional. Enough is enough. What has the U.S. done for us? Is this a shift on the part of the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas?
It's a shift in the rhetoric of Hanan Ashrawi, who's trying to keep up with the mood of Palestinian society, which is just restive and frustrated and sick of the Palestinian Authority's subservient relationship to Israel and the United States. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is essentially the greatest gift to the Israeli occupation that it's ever received. They are the occupation subcontractor who manage the Bantustans on behalf of the Israeli military so they don't have to enter. And what we saw in June when the Israeli military raided Ramallah were Mahmoud Abbas's security services fighting alongside the Israeli military against stone-throwing Palestinian youth. That was the perfect example of Mahmoud Abbas's leadership or lack thereof. His leadership is completely contingent on U.S. support. The Palestinian Authority is completely reliant on Congress and the State of Israel, and they've created a system in which 1 out of 4 people in the West Bank depend on Palestinian Authority salaries, which are basically international welfare and band-aids for the occupied people. So if the Palestinian Authority goes away, that whole house of cards collapses because these are heads of household. Everyone is dependent on these salaries. If they stop taking aid from the U.S., the money stops coming in, and there is a widespread revolt that would take the form of another intifada. The only person standing in between that is Mahmoud Abbas. And we saw that when there was pressure to go to the ICC to prosecute the kind of atrocities that I just described for you guys that I documented in the Gaza Strip. All of the heads of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had agreed to go to the ICC. Everyone except Mahmoud Abbas. And the ICC at the last second received an emissary from Abbas withdrawing the application from the PLO heads. Even Hamas agreed to go to the ICC, knowing that they too could be prosecuted for war crimes during Protective Edge and before. So it all falls on the shoulders of Abbas, and it's Abbas, as I said, who is the greatest gift to the Israeli occupation, and that's why we're hearing this increasingly radical rhetoric from him. It's to obscure his policies and his real actions on the ground.
Do you think that Israel first attacked the Palestinians in the West Bank after the kids were kidnapped, to go after the unity government of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. That was the greatest threat to them.
Well, of course. I mean, I didn't have time to talk about this at the onset, but Benjamin Netanyahu, the Shin Bet, the Israeli General Security Services, and the police had a recording of a call by one of the teens after he'd been kidnapped to the police in which gunshots were heard, in which the killers were heard celebrating. Netanyahu, the police, the Shin Bet knew the teens were dead. They found bullets and blood in the car, but they didn't want the Israeli public to know. They even knew the names of the suspects. They knew the names of the two kidnappers. They had interrogated their families and were searching for them, and this could have been a small, isolated police action. But they wanted a wider action to attack Hamas, to create friction in the West Bank, and so the Israeli military imposed a gag order on the Israeli media. No reporting on the investigation, on the phone call, or even the existence of the investigation. And so any Israeli journalist who reported on the existence of an investigation or the existence of this phone call could be court-martialed. Some 0% of Israelis knew that the teens were dead. Only Netanyahu and his inner circle. And it was in order to give them latitude to conduct this operation in the West Bank under the cover of a rescue operation searching for the teens. 2 weeks later, the teens were found in a shallow grave on the property of one of the killers whose name the Shin Bet already had, Marwan Kawasme, and they were found not by the police, but by a team of volunteer Israeli hikers. And that's when the incitement exploded and the death to Arabs mobs poured out, and Netanyahu unleashed this chaos. But before then, he was trying to shake up and fracture the unity government, and that's why he deployed this cynical manipulation which led ultimately to the war in the Gaza Strip.
Why was this unity government so threatening to Netanyahu?
Well, it wasn't terribly threatening, but it's always been Netanyahu's policy to delegitimize the Palestinians as a political entity. The Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling called it politicide, the attempt to destroy part or all of a political entity. You destroy Palestinians as a political entity and you destroy them as a people. And to do this, you need to create friction. You need to create divisions. The division between Fatah and Hamas, which played out with the brief civil war in the Gaza Strip, was the greatest gift to the Israeli government that we've ever seen. It's why the Israeli government actually armed and funded Fatah with the cooperation of the Bush administration to go into the Gaza Strip and attack Hamas. The idea that they could act as a unified entity, that Hamas would be legitimized, was a huge threat to Netanyahu, and the U.S. recognized the unity government after blaming Netanyahu for the failure of the peace process. So he's totally exposed. The government's totally exposed, and they need a way to reverse this scenario. What better way to get the U.S. and Congress on your side and to elicit world sympathy than to initiate a war and to rail against Palestinian terror? That's exactly what they did.
How was Hamas created?
Hamas was created, the origins of Hamas lay in Mandate Palestine, but I don't want to go back that far. Hamas was simply an outgrowth of the Islamist current in North Africa and the Levant. They were basically a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they emerged in the 1980s partly with the assistance of the Israeli Shin Bet. They were used basically to fracture the PLO, which was the secular ruler of the Gaza Strip at the time, and the West Bank. And they were basically given free rein to organize. PLO leaders were always complaining that the Israeli military would never crack down on Hamas rallies, would never arrest Hamas leaders, and it was true. They've since admitted that they used Hamas to destabilize the PLO. Hamas even received up to 100,000 shekels from the Mossad to conduct events, met privately with the Israeli military. And now that Hamas is in power, it appears that there are attempts, not necessarily by the Israeli security services, but definitely by allies of Israel among the Egyptian junta or the United Arab Emirates, to destabilize Hamas by supporting Salafist elements that are sympathetic to ISIS. And that's what we've seen again and again in the Gaza Strip.
The significance of the Palestinian Unity Government for the first time meeting in Gaza recently?
I think the Palestinian Unity Government has been effectively broken. The Palestinian Authority is acting again as kind of an arm of the occupation. They're seeking a way back into the Gaza Strip, and they have now been given control over the border crossings to erode Hamas's sovereignty. So I don't really, and the unity government is non-functional. We saw workers who were working for Hamas-controlled ministries not get paid and work for months without salaries, while workers who were connected to the Palestinian Authority and Fatah receive salaries and stay home. This kind of dynamic is promoting division, and it's being deployed deliberately. So this unity government, I don't see how it is going to how it's functioning at this point.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there is a role for a mass Palestinian nonviolent movement?
The most revered person in Palestine right now is Abu Obaida, and he is the masked spokesman for the Al-Qassam brigades, which took the fight to Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip, which conducted daring operations against Israeli military bases through tunnels, which achieved some of its greatest gains ever seen, killing up to 75 Israeli soldiers who were invading the Gaza Strip. And Abu Obaida, though he's connected to Hamas, emphasizes unity. And when I saw him speak at the victory celebration, the quote-unquote victory celebration, in the rubble of Shujaiya, one of the most surreal scenes I've ever seen in my life. He was standing on stage with representatives of every faction, Fatah, the DFLP, the PFLP, and that is what, that's why he's receiving admiration. And he speaks a language that resonates with people who've been turned into orphans, who've been attacked. He's giving them a sense of strength and dignity. I prefer nonviolence. It's just my way. It's my sensibility. And towards the end of my book, I document the rise and fall of the unarmed popular struggle in the West Bank. There was simply no way that this movement could succeed against the Israeli military and the Palestinian Authority, which refused to broaden the struggle. And so, one by one, its leaders were picked off, arrested at night, taken to prisons. Their children were taken to jail, arrested at night, and basically terrorized into submission. The protests continue, but I really haven't seen them bear any impact. The only impact I've seen has been borne out by the Al-Qassam brigades. And it's unfortunate because this suggests that the Israeli axiom that Arabs only understand force is actually a projection of its own psyche, and that they're the ones who only seem to speak the language of violence and understand force.
What about the Israelis who protested? Talk about what happened during the period.
Yeah, I really wish I had time to talk about this more. This was what happened to the hundreds of Israeli dissidents who came out and protested the war in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa was seminal because for the first time they faced organized right-wing attacks. They were photographed at demonstrations. Their photographs went up on a Facebook page called Order Number 8. Order Number 8 is the order given to Israeli reservists to enlist, to go to war. And some were followed home and attacked at their doorsteps. There were organized mob attacks on demonstrations in Tel Aviv. In Haifa, a demonstration, which was an incredible show of solidarity between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis against the war, was pelted with stones while the police stood and watched. And what my friends are telling me among these beleaguered and very castigated left-wing factions is that they want to leave. They've given up. There's no space left for them in liberal Tel Aviv. That, I think, is one of the most tragic outcomes. Gideon Levy, who many of you know as probably the most prominent dissident voice, he's a columnist for Haaretz, received so many death threats when he criticized the Israeli Air Force and the atrocities he was committing, that Haaretz had to hire a bodyguard for him. Hanin Zouabi, one of the most prominent voices against Israeli internal racism and mistreatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel. A Palestinian representative in the Knesset was suspended for 6 months for stuff she said, for basically going off script and saying that the kidnappers of the 3 Israeli teens were not terrorists. Whether you agree with that or not, her free speech rights should have been protected, but she's been silenced. Israeli journalists and pundits who supported the war faced threats and attacks for perceived support of the war. That's how insane the mob became in Israel during Protective Edge. And it was incited from the top by people like Ayelet Shaked, the whip of the Jewish Home Party, who called for a genocide of Palestinian mothers so that they won't give birth to little snakes. It was incited by people like Moshe Feiglin, who have called for the extermination policies in the Gaza Strip and camps to be built in the Sinai Desert for people being expelled. It was incited by Rabbi Noam Perel, the head of the B'nai Akiva movement, which is the largest religious nationalist movement in the world, who called for the slaughter of Palestinians according to the biblical tale of Phineas, in which Samson returns with 300 foreskins of Philistines. It was incited by Benjamin Netanyahu, who called Palestinians human animals, and all those who called those who demonstrated in solidarity with them traitors. And that, to me, this to me was the final stage of any attempt by the state of Israel to portray itself as a liberal democracy. The mask is off. Leftists have nowhere left to go. And that's why I really think it's up to us. It's up to those of us on the outside to intervene. The force has to be applied from the outside. There's no hope for change from within.
Talk about the U.S. support of Israel, and if you feel it shifted at all during this period.
There was a congressional resolution. In the Senate, there was a resolution in support of the Israeli military campaign during Protective Edge. This was after most of the atrocities that I described occurred. And it passed 100-0. I mean, it was a slam dunk. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren voted with the Israeli military. And when I recently asked Bernie Sanders, and you were there at a climate change event in New York, at a really important event, I didn't want to derail it totally, but I had to ask him, can you explain your vote? Just explain it. And he just walked right away from me. In previous questioners have asked him, to explain, and he said, that's not where his mind is. This is someone who's thinking of running for president, but he doesn't want to talk about one of the key international issues and social justice issues of our time. Elizabeth Warren has also refused to talk about it. It's clear that they're acting on the basis of fundraiser pressure, that if there were funds coming at them in another direction, they might have voted another way. So just think about that. If they're willing to just totally abandon millions of people to the malevolence of one of the most powerful militaries in the world because of fundraiser pressure, who else could they abandon? Who's next? Who's next?
But do you feel there is a shift in public opinion in the United States?
There's a massive shift in public opinion. I mean, this event right now could not have happened 10 years ago. This is a sign of the times. And Palestine is becoming a litmus test on the left. The campus is becoming the central battleground in the fight for Palestine. And I know we have some members of Students for Justice in Palestine here right now. This is the group that's taking the fight to the occupation. This is the most important group on the issue of Palestine in this country right now, and they deserve your total support. And they were responsible also for making my book tour a success, for helping make it possible when so many other groups wouldn't. You also see groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which now has more chapters on campus than J Street U, which is a liberal Zionist group, and I'm seeing members of J Street U make a massive exodus to JVP. I tell them switching to JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, is easier than renewing your driver's license. And it's a whole lot more fun. Look at the Pew polls on Jewish American attitudes. They're remarkable. They're absolutely remarkable. A slim majority of Jewish Americans no longer believes that the Israeli government is serious about making peace. A minority of Jewish Americans believe, this is like 43%, that Israel is the promised land, that it was given to Jews by God, whereas 83% of evangelicals believe it is. That's the Israeli government's safety belt in the Bible Belt. They're turning to anti-Semitic Christians who believe that Jerusalem is the landing pad for the Messiah, and that when he comes, I will have to convert or burn in an everlasting lake of fire, which, if it's everlasting, I'll probably get used to. So I think the momentum on the grassroots is incredible. And I mean, and just having been on this book tour, I'm seeing it everywhere I go from so many remarkable people. I think after, I talked about how I was kind of broken with Operation Cast Lead. Now I'm seeing so many young American Jews and just young people in general having the same reaction to Operation Protective Edge, and where they go is going to have an enormous impact. And then finally, there's the second and third generation of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans are much more assertive than their parents. That's the base of Students for Justice in Palestine. And they're doing kind of like what my parents' generation did on campus when my father joined Students for a Democratic Society. He knew that immigrant tradition too. I mean, I knew my great-grandmother who came over on a boat. What Students for SDS was saying in the 60s, this was a group that was heavily Jewish, filled with immigrants. Tom Hayden was from an Irish immigrant background. They're saying, we're here, we're going to make this a better society and assert ourselves as Americans. That's what the Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and Students for Justice in Palestine are doing. They're saying, we're here, we're not intimidated, you can't censor us, you can't silence us, and we're going to change your foreign policy so you stop killing our friends and family and our brothers and sisters back home. And
talk about AIPAC.
Yeah, AIPAC? Well, AIPAC remains the second most powerful lobby in the US next to the NRA. Unlike the NRA, there aren't people driving around in pickup trucks everywhere you go with AIPAC stickers. They have no popular base. They're completely top-heavy. They focus entirely on the 1% of our society, on buying off elites, on tokenism, on racial tokenism, on gender tokenism, on any and on buying off Congress. And they've been very successful at it. But the 99% is turning away from not just AIPAC, but from are repelled by the entire vision they're seeing of Israel's occupation of Palestine. And what we need to see Israel as is not something that's unique. It's not uniquely bad. And don't trust anyone who says Israel's uniquely evil and it's acting against American interests. Those people are seeking to cover up or conceal the kind of evils that America's participating in. Israel is the most severe image of ourselves. Israel's the most severe image of the West, and it's what we can and will be unless we intervene. We have to see Gaza. We have to see Gaza and Palestine as a whole as the most severe image of the 99% of people who are increasingly being dispossessed and left behind, who are revolting and who are finding themselves beneath an increasingly sophisticated and brutal mechanism of domination and control. We are entering an era of human warehousing, of surplus humanity, of people being economically cast aside, and Gaza is the most severe iteration and image of this process. We're witnessing a globalization of Gaza, and that's why this issue should be so central to all of our social justice concerns and all of our activism.
Max, thank you very much.
Thank you. You should shake hands or something. Thanks a lot.